Spending the past two videos yapping about issues and potential changes for fighting games, Bandai Namco dropped a trailer for the next DLC character for Tekken, Anna Williams. To prevent this from becoming a reaction video, I'll keep impressions short. She looks great. Mrs. Claus has never looked better, and I can appreciate Tekken 8's dedication toward creating a distinct visual and gameplay identity for each character. However, looking over this trailer reminded me of something that always bothered me about this genre. Something I've had many an unhinged rant about in private with friends. Fighting games have a serious problem. Women. Well, actually, let me rephrase that. Female characters. While there are a sizable number of them, and many of them are great, there's a question I'm sure many of you haven't considered. Where are the elderly women in fighting games? Seriously, if you haven't pondered this before, take a moment to. Just pause the video and think about it. Can you think of any old women that are playable in a fighting game? Even just one? Somehow I doubt you could come up with even one, because checking, and boy did I check, there are none. Street Fighter, none. Mortal Kombat, none. Tekken, none. King of Fighters, none. Guilty Gear Strive, none. Uni, none. Melty Blood, none. I think you're getting the point by now. And just so that our standards properly map onto reality, when I'm referring to elderly women, I'm not referring to women slightly above the age of 20. I'm referring to women at the very least above the age of 50. Even that is arguably being generous. Now in theory, it could be possible that some long-forgotten niche fighting game from years bygone might have this kind of character, and I'm just not aware of it. And I'm sure if there is such a game with such a character, somebody will let me know. But at the very least, it should be clear that in the modern era of fighting games, and even prior, there's essentially zero representation for an entire demographic of half the population. Of course, I'm not delusional about how character design, game design, and overall marketing works. I understand that when it comes to designing characters for these games, you're going to see prioritization of certain universally liked and appealing character archetypes within the scope of the industry itself. Most shonen protagonists are young Japanese males between the age of 12 to 30. It isn't a coincidence that the largest general demographic for shonen anime and manga are Japanese males between the ages of 12 to 30. While it would be very amusing to see a fighting game made up entirely of elderly women as playable characters, I'm also not under the delusion that such a game would sell at all outside of some sort of vague novelty. Characters are designed the way they are, generally speaking, for a tangible reason. As an example, in Uni, the character Yuzuriha was specifically created when the developers noticed the absence of any kind of sex appeal among the female characters, something that is surprisingly important in this genre, for better or for worse. It should also go without saying that not every character is designed strictly to be as marketable as possible. Particularly when it comes to fighting games, variety is key, and as such, diversity is also something to be considered. Of course, the level of variety present will also depend on the stylistic choices of the game itself. Typically in the case of anime games, you either get a relatively homogeneous cast of the general body archetype you see for most anime characters, or you get wild extremes of character designs with different shapes and sizes. Personally, I find Guilty Gear to be a notably good example of variety in character design, though even that game lacks a single elderly female character. But it's not just about the inclusion of new female characters, it's also about this genre's treatment of its existing legacy characters. The most obvious example being Street Fighter, with a lot of its core female cast seeming to never age over time, at least not in any meaningful way, especially in comparison to their male counterparts. Let's use Street Fighter 6 as an example of this. Historically speaking, Street Fighter has always been fascinated with the idea of a next generation of characters, progressing the overall timeline of the games ever since Street Fighter 3. However, due to the initial lackluster reception of Street Fighter 3, Capcom would go on to play it a bit safe when it came to future entries in the series, coming to a head in Street Fighter 5, where they would eventually tease the idea of a next generation of characters once again, coming full circle in Street Fighter 6. Combine all of this with the existence of the Street Fighter Alpha series, and we can see the Street Fighter timeline jump back and forth, with the age and design of the main characters also going back and forth as time progresses and regresses. Taking art style changes into account, we can see that there's a noticeable aging process that goes on for a lot of the core male cast, most notably Ryu, Ken, and Guile. By Street Fighter 6, the furthest point in the franchise's timeline, these characters are noticeably aged. In the case of Ryu and Ken, these characters are noticeably older than their Third Strike counterparts, which at the time of that game's release was supposed to be the next generation, symbolizing the largest time skip in the series. Coming around to the female cast, we have Chun-Li and Cammy. We can even throw Juri in there. Despite some design changes over the years, frankly speaking, these characters simply do not age in any meaningful way. Maybe if you compare it to Street Fighter Alpha, you might see some difference in age, but that game was noticeably trying to make all of the characters younger, which, for the female cast, making them younger isn't exactly controversial. Any meaningful variance you could find in the depiction of these characters' ages can really just be chalked up to changes in the overall art style of the series, or changes in the game engine used. When comparing these characters to their male counterparts, it's very clear that the male characters have a tangible effort put into showing them aging. Hell, I would argue that Juri looks even younger than she did before, but keep that concept of a new generation in your head for later. I want to move on to a series that I think has some of the most egregious issues when it comes to representing its female cast, Tekken. Now don't get me wrong, I love this game. It's my primary fighting game of choice. That being said, however, I think that Tekken is pretty bad when it comes to its female characters. It's not about the number of female characters. It's not even just about the age of the female characters. It's about the way these games use their female characters that I think is noticeably lacking. While I know the community has mixed feelings about this character overall, I've always had an appreciation for Lydia when she was announced for Tekken 7 and released for Tekken 8. This is due to her feeling like a breath of fresh air for one particular reason. She's an actual female fighter. Not a female character, but a female fighter. A martial artist that takes fighting seriously and has some sort of tangible role in the story's events come Tekken 8. I have no problem with characters just being played up for laughs, or representing some sort of trope or archetype, but there's a noticeably large proportion of these characters on the female side of Tekken. If I were to ask you to name male characters in Tekken that feel like a genuine martial artist, that, while not always played seriously 100% of the time, at the very least represent a tangible fighting style and show some effort in maintaining said fighting style, you'd probably end up naming essentially every male character in the game. Even characters like Lars that more play into the anime elements of the franchise are still taken seriously in the context of the story, and characters that are fully played up for laughs like Bob aren't even in Tekken 8. Compare that to the female cast. How many fighters are actually in the female cast of Tekken? Now, for the sake of better defining our terms, I'm going to define a fighter as someone who represents a tangible fighting style and is the notable practitioner of said fighting style, or is someone who plays an active role in the lore and is portrayed seriously. That leaves us with Xiao Yu, Jun, Nina, Zafina, Lydia, and possibly Anna. That's 6, compared to essentially every other male character in the game. The remaining characters are essentially played up for laughs, or are there to be waifus. But how bad is all of this really? Sure, there isn't as much female representation, but the primary demographic for fighting games are men anyway. Isn't this mostly just like a marketing thing? Again, it's not about the quantity of female characters, it's about the quality of female characters, and Tekken's treatment of its female characters is lacking, to say the least. To show this, we have to talk about new generation characters. Street Fighter is downright obsessed with this concept. There are 2 things that are guaranteed in Street Fighter: new Shotos and replacing existing characters with alternatives. Guile and Remy, the 3 Bushinryu characters, Sakura, Lily, Aki, the list goes on. Street Fighter games have always represented different eras in the series. With a new era, it tends to come new representatives for existing styles and characters. But you'll notice a trend with many of these characters. There are a lot of new generation Street Fighter characters that are young female replacements for their existing counterparts. But let's be fair, good female representation is less about context and more about content, and Street Fighter is pretty good when it comes to this. Sure, nearly all of these characters look barely above 21, if that, but the actual characterization itself can be pretty good at times. In the case of Menat, this character is so well made that I almost don't want to count her as a new generation character. Instead, just being somebody with a strong relationship to a pre-existing character. Sure, she shares some moves with Rose superficially, but in terms of her characterization and design, she's very distinct and has a very charming personality. In terms of style and gameplay, she's one of the most unique characters in Street Fighter history, and though she may not be the most story-relevant character, the story of Street Fighter V had long concluded by the time of her inclusion. Personally, I find Menat to be the gold standard of a new generation character. Someone with a connection to their predecessor, but does their own thing and has a unique style and aesthetic. A non-fighting game example of this would be Nero in Devil May Cry. Of course, when it comes to fighting games, this kind of character does come with its own set of drawbacks, notably in that, when you eliminate an existing character and replace them with a character that is noticeably different, you're essentially erasing that previous character's gameplay style and moveset for the community to use. You're tangibly losing something when you replace it with something different. While I personally view it as an admirable display of design ambition, I could also see why some people wouldn't be happy with it. For an interesting example of this concept, we have to move back to Tekken and take a look at my favorite character, Jin. With his debut in Tekken 3, Jin can be viewed as a replacement character for Kazuya, who notably died in the previous game and wasn't included in this one. However, he was also a different take on the character, being a more traditional protagonist, someone who didn't seem to carry the baggage associated with the Mishima Zaibatsu. However, in terms of gameplay utility, he was firmly in the camp of being a new generation version of his father. With Kazuya's return in Tekken 4, and the notable shift toward a more grounded and serious tone, Jin's character would be changed radically. Not only would he be written as a more jaded and morally ambiguous character, his fighting style would be completely changed to traditional karate instead of the Mishima version. Keep in mind, Jin is firmly the protagonist of the series at this point, so you can imagine that completely changing his playstyle and moveset for story purposes was quite the ambitious choice for a franchise. It's this exact level of care put into a character that makes me so disappointed with how the female cast is treated in these games, because when Tekken wants its characters to stay young, the devs will do anything in their power to keep those characters young. Female characters are not allowed to age in these games, period. This results in Tekken having, in my opinion, some of the worst examples of new generation characters present in the genre. Characters that come off as having very little in the way of actual artistic intent, and instead feeling entirely like cynical marketing gimmicks. We'll shoot off a few before getting into a notable example. Eddie being replaced with Christy in Tekken 4, despite being an Easter egg on the character select screen. Why? Michelle being replaced with Julia, Raven being replaced with Master Raven, Bruce being replaced by Josie? To be fair, Tekken 7 just had an awful set of new characters, but there are 3 notable characters that need to be discussed to cap off this video: Nina, June, and Reina. These 3 characters are interesting because they do have a lot going for them in many ways, but they also represent some of the worst aspects of Tekken's approach to female characters. Starting with Nina, she represents the most desperate attempt to manage the appearance of a female character in these games. There aren't many characters remaining from Tekken 1. Most have been either replaced, killed off, or scarcely make an appearance. Those who have managed to consistently return have shown age over time, especially in Tekken 8 with the new detailed faces. However, Nina, despite being in the starting roster of every entry, and even technically being Steve Fox's mother, has shown no signs of said aging, physically resembling a woman in the prime of her 20s. How did this happen, you might ask? Why, cryosleep, of course. That's right. In order to keep Nina around come Tekken 3's time skip, her, along with Anna, were captured and put into cryostasis for research. Normally, this sort of thing could be chalked up to some fun lore. But moving on to Jun, you start to realize just how much story potential is lost when devs go out of their way to keep all of these characters in their prime youth. Prior to Tekken 8, Jun was an elusive character who always piqued the interest of fans. Her notable absence for every major entry after Tekken 2, combined with her consistent importance to the story and connection to the main cast, made the prospect of her return a source of hype. However, the likelihood of said return was always in the air, as we'd see a successor to her fighting style come Tekken 5 in the form of Asuka, Jin's cousin. Asuka is another example of a weak new generation character, never having a place in any major story events, and being played for jokes and fan service. Though being popular in the community, there really isn't much to her outside of fan service, a sharp contrast to her much more interesting aunt. However, a big surprise would come in the form of Jun's return in Tekken 8. Though there's one thing that many people just couldn't quite overlook. She's young. In fact, she looks even younger than her mature portrayal in Tekken Tag 2. She went from being Jin's mother to looking like a potential girlfriend. This is just disappointing to see. Considering how we already have a young take on the Kazuma fighting style with Asuka, you would think that the devs would allow a character who had been missing for years to come back older and with a fresh perspective on how things have changed in that time. Instead, we get a character who is relatively dry, just a standard peacemaker mom character who looks like she's in college. The most fascinating thing about Jun is her relationship to other key characters. It would have been interesting to see her judge the men in her life who have caused so much harm in her absence. She's Kazuya's only source of humanity, the person who kept Jin from becoming evil, and the woman who trusted Heihachi with her son in her hour of need. It feels like we lose so much potential payoff just to maintain the status quo with the female cast, making Jun's return feel hollow outside of a potential new main. But let's shift focus back onto the new. Reina was meant to be Heihachi's replacement following his death at the end of Tekken 7. A fact that everybody surmised from taking one look at her trailer. Being the old man's daughter and protege, she inherits many of his signature moves and his general cocky yet charismatic demeanor. Honestly, she's a great character in many respects. A solid example of a new generation character done right, though I do think they leaned into her having Heihachi's personality maybe a little bit too much, but it's still a personality type noticeably absent among the female cast. There's just one thing that's always bothered me about her: the look. Why is she so small? Not just short, mind you, but weak looking. This isn't any normal character. This is the successor to Heihachi's legacy, well, for the first few months of the game at least. The story gives her the amount of respect befitting such a character in that regard, with her showing some amazing feats against her family. That's just the thing though, her general look really stretches the whole thing. We're talking holding off a powered up Devil Kazuya in terms of individual strength. I'm not saying she has to be built like a mountain, but this is the one female character who really ought to have had a bit of muscle mass to them. Hell, Lydia is the only member of the cast with abs, and she gets ragdolled by the one human Mishima she's faced. I like Reina, but she's held back by the invisible rules of these characters. When I imagine a female replacement for Heihachi, I see the opportunity of a lifetime for this genre. The first notable, playable, aged female character. A badass old Japanese woman to really shake things up. But alas, a Mishima undergrad is what we have. And with the Big Daddy's return, it's hard to even imagine a place for her to shine anymore. Just another waifu for the battle pass. But that's my take on things. Would you guys like to see an old woman be playable? Tell me why not in the comments. Till next time, take care.